cold chained the earth. The wind swept across the roofs and howled in the crevices like a wild beast. Somewhere in peasant huts, people were gnawing on frozen turnips and praying for spring. But behind the high walls of the boyars' chambers, it was warm, bright, and nourishing. Massive wooden tables, covered with rich food, radiated prosperity. Fried swans with horseradish, smoked sturgeons, kvass pies with game, thick soup on beef tail, mead, fragrant herbal infusions. Each meal was not just a ritual of satiation, but a demonstration of power, prestige, subtle knowledge of nature, and seasonal opportunities. Boyar food is a reflection of the strategic thinking of its time. How to preserve food without salt and ice, how to eat heartily in bitter cold, how to poison or survive when the table is part of politics and war. Food was a weapon, a means of intimidation and a sign of power. Even the choice of meat or the way a meal was served could tell of kin, status, intentions. It was an era when hunger was at every door, and the ability to eat not only deliciously, but also intelligently meant survival and power. What did the richest and most influential people of Russia eat when poverty and cold reigned all around? What filled their table, what dishes were truly elite, and what secret recipes have survived to this day as a true science of survival? The boyar's diet was based on meat. In the boyar's household, the smell of meat was not just a part of life, it was its heart, its essence, its proof of power and authority. A boyar would not sit down at the table without a roast goose, a roasted wild boar, or a pile of beef stew simmering in a cauldron with onions and spicy roots. Meat was an everyday thing, but at the same time a symbol of wealth, because only a rich man could afford to eat it daily in any form and volume. Beef, mutton, veal, as well as the meat of wild game caught in the forest, such as elk, boars, deer, and even bears if the hunting was particularly good. Baked venison with juniper smoke and lingonberry gravy was considered an exquisite dish worthy of the prince's table, and therefore served not only as food, but also as a kind of demonstration of hunting prowess. Meat in Russia was not only eaten, it was shown, it was proud. It was presented as a gift to other influential houses. To survive the long winter months, when there was no fresh prey, meat was prepared, salted in large oak barrels, smoked in huts, hanging carcasses over hearths, or dried in the cold. Smoked wild boar meat could be stored for weeks and served as the basis for soups, porridge, and pies, especially during campaigns or sieges. Historical chronicles mention how in the time of Prince Yaroslav, a boyar feast began with boiled beef served in spicy kvass with mustard and radish. Not only men, but also women from boyar clans participated in hunts, especially falconry, and personally took part in gutting the prey. Bear meat was of special value. It was believed to give strength and endurance, but it was eaten only in the circle of loved ones, with caution and reverence. Boar meat with garlic and onions was stewed in the oven overnight, and in the morning it exuded an aroma that made the servants salivate. Meat was not only food, it played a ritual and political role. Guests were seated at the table according to their importance, and the most prestigious dishes were served first: swan, duck with quince, pheasant roasted on a spit. The ability to process meat was passed on by inheritance. The boyar cookhouse was a whole household, where the cook knew which piece was suitable for frying and which for stewing in a pot with vegetables. Some boyar houses had special carvers and salters, whose task was to provide the master with fresh game even in March or November. Hunting was not just a hobby, it was a matter of status and, in fact, survival. A good shot from a bow or a trap on a wild boar could mean a week of a well-fed table without the need to pull the last corned beef from the cellar. The boyar kept an account of his successful hunts, and the skins of the hunted animals were hung over the doors, reminding of the former valor. There was even an unofficial meat code on what day, what dishes should be served so as not to lower the dignity of the family. Festive feasts were not without stuffed geese, boars baked in dough with horseradish, and thick meat chowder, from which steam stood over the table in a thick veil. The chronicler of a monastery in Novgorod once noted that the boyar Vsevolod ordered for his daughter's wedding 3 wild boar carcasses, a 5th beef, 20 geese, 40 hens, and 2 swans as a sign of power. And in the south of Russia, in Pereyaslav, even the carcasses of a wild donkey, a rare game, especially valued in the steppe boyar circles, were used. Meat was also sacrificed in temples and monasteries, especially on holidays. In this way, the boyars showed generosity and strengthened ties with the clergy. However, even in times of peace, meat on the table was a form of protection. It was a sense of the strength of the family, the stability of the economy, and the strength of ties with the hunting grounds. When hunger from the north drove the peasants mad, the boyars' cellars were full of corned beef and dried duck, and it was such supplies that allowed them to conduct long winter negotiations without losing their dignity. Often in battle campaigns, the boyars were accompanied by mobile kitchen wagons, where meat was stewed right on the road. The campaign cauldrons were boiling, regardless of the terrain and time. Sometimes they feasted even in the cold, by torches, in the open air, as if proving that neither cold nor night had no power over the true strength of the family. Every bone from the hunt, every dish from the feast became part of the family memory, stored not only in the legends, but also in the bodily memory of the house. That's why meat was not just a food, but a symbol of peace, power, hunting, and survival in a world where cold, hunger, and strength of hand decided everything. Fish is an indispensable element of Lenten luxury. During the days of Lent, when meat and dairy products were forbidden, fish became the main symbol of refined boyar luxury and ingenuity of the table. But not ordinary fish was eaten, but the fish that had been obtained with the greatest labor and was expensive. Sturgeon with a mighty back, severyuga with silver scales, nelma, the queen of the north. These fish were served not just boiled or fried. They were stuffed, decorated with juniper berries, wrapped in dough, stewed in beer, and even served under sweet and sour sauces with honey and vinegar. At Lenten feasts, the tables of the boyars were bursting with sterlet, pike, burbot, and pike perch, and in the center always stood a magnificent fish baked in the shape of a beast or bird. Northern rivers yielded especially valuable species. For example, the Arkhangelsk boyars were famous for serving muksun and ripple, which were caught in icy water in spring and salted according to a special recipe. In Novgorod of the 13th century, fish from Ilmen was not only for food, but also for exchange with other principalities. In this way, even during the fasting period, diplomatic threads were preserved. Sometimes fish was wilted right in the house, hung in long corridors away from the stove, and the smell became part of the everyday atmosphere. Large boyar courts had fish kitchens where fish soup was boiled. Fish was stewed in kvass and stewed with onion juice to preserve its flavor even in the bitter cold. It is known that boyars built artificial ponds on their lands, not only for the sake of freshness of the product, but also as a symbol of care for the household, a reflection of status and foresight. In such ponds, they bred carp, tench, sometimes even perch, and in winter they cut holes and pulled out the catch as needed. Fish caught by one's own hand was especially valued. In many families, there was a tradition to go to the pond, accompanied by the eldest son, and cast the net together to keep the connection with the land. During the visits of distinguished guests, fish became the basis of Lenten diplomacy. It was shaped like animals, sprinkled with cranberries, decorated with crayfish tails, and served in silver dishes, causing admiration and envy. Even caviar in Lent was eaten in a big way. Beluga, sturgeon, pike, sometimes mixed with crushed cranberries or horseradish. Old manuscripts mention recipes for Lenten fish milk, a special chowder to which almond milk was added to imitate the creamy flavor. There were even special fish feasts when the whole table was covered with lean but rich treats. Sour fish, fish in kvass, dried and grated fish cakes, fish jelly, and baked heads with pearl soup. Such feasts were a manifestation of the host's generosity and his ability to observe church norms with grace. Lent was not a time of frugality. On the contrary, it became a demonstration of strength, discipline, and taste. Fish on a boyar's menu meant not a restriction, but an opportunity to show how to create splendor out of small things. In the monastery chronicles, there are records of boyars bringing hundreds of fish for offerings, a sign of respect for the church and a way to strengthen ties with the clergy. And at the prince's courts, there was even a fish post, a special manager responsible only for the supply of fresh, salted, dried, and dried fish. He knew from which shore it was better to take Nelma, in which month pike perch was fattest, and how to store sturgeon so that it would not lose its flavor even in the middle of winter. Old-time merchants brought overseas fish, such as tuna or anchovies, and although they cost a great deal of money, boyar families bought them for the sake of rarity and impression. Stalls along the banks of the Volga were full of dried fish hung in bundles, and in the markets fish roe was exchanged for furs and iron. Even on campaigns, the boyars did not refuse the usual luxury. Fish was dried in advance, put in bags and boiled in camp cauldrons, giving flavor with mustard, dried ramson and onions. When the ice melted in the spring and fish came to the rivers to spawn, boyar families organized special meals in honor of the renewal, in which they symbolically ate only fresh fish boiled in clean water with salt and garlic. Fish food in the boyar's house was not inferior to meat food in refinement, just expressed in other shades, flavors, and gestures. Lenten days turned into a competition. Who would cook the pike more deliciously? Who would decorate the sterlet more intricately? Who would serve the caviar appetizer more original? The boyars understood. Food is not just satiation. It is a language in which one can tell about oneself, declare one's boundaries, one's connections, one's steadfastness. And in this language, fish sounded like purity, endurance, piety, but at the same time, like wealth, skill, and confidence in the future. Bread is a symbol of prosperity, not just food. In a boyar's house, bread was not just an everyday product, but a true symbol of prosperity, stability, and power, especially if it was a white wheat loaf. While peasants were content with rye or barley bread, often with impurities of swede or chaff, the boyar's table always contained fragrant, airy bread made of the finest milled wheat flour. Wheat was not grown in large quantities in the northern lands, so it had to be imported from southern principalities or abroad. And this in itself spoke of the owner's wealth. Baking white bread required special skill, and in the large houses of the boyars worked entire bread cooks who knew dozens of recipes, from a soft loaf to a honey loaf with raisins and coriander. Sometimes honey, caraway seeds, dried pears or apples were added to the dough, not only for taste, but also to emphasize the refinement of the table and the generosity of the host. Bread was served not only as a side dish, but also as an independent dish. Fragrant loaves filled with cottage cheese or nuts, browned in the oven, decorated with seeds and curls. At receptions, bread was laid on separate wooden boards, often covered with carvings or cloth to show respect for the food and its sanctity. It is known that when welcoming distinguished guests, the host himself could serve them a piece of bread with salt, a gesture of peace, hospitality, and ancient ritual. Bread accompanied all dishes, even fish or sweet dishes, and served as a kind of flavor anchor, connecting the diversity of the feast into a single composition. On the day of a major holiday, such as Christmas or Trinity, the table was served with crushed bread. Loaves, which before serving were dipped in honey, rubbed with spices, and decorated with carved patterns. The shapes of bread were varied, round like the sun, oblong like boats, in the shape of birds or animals. Each shape had a meaning, especially if the bread was intended as a gift or ritual. In boyar harems, special rooms were set aside for bread bins, cool with ovens next door, where flour and leaven were stored, and where women baked not only for the house, but also for distribution to servants and guests. White bread was considered not just a food, but an object of prestige. It was brought to the table in the first rows, and if it was on the tray, no one doubted. The host was rich and generous. Mentions of boyar bread can be found even in spiritual charters, where it was stipulated which of the heirs would receive income from mills, from the sale of flour, or from bread shops. At solemn events, bread was lighted, offered as a symbol of fertility and God's favor, and even placed in the cradle of a newborn, believing that it would bring health and prosperity. When a boyar went on a journey, he was obliged to put a piece of consecrated bread in his trunk, not only as food, but also as an amulet. It is interesting that in times of severe crop failures, bread became a kind of currency. Furs, silver, or even the services of a blacksmith could be exchanged for a loaf. Wealthy families made stocks in advance. They built oak storages, where sacks of flour were ranked from coarse rye to the finest white flour. Some chronicles mention special bread days when dozens of loaves were baked to distribute to the poor. This was not so much a show of mercy as a public demonstration of the boyars' power and responsibility. On special days, the children of the boyars were baked small-shaped breads in the form of horses, birds, fish, to teach them respect and understanding of the meaning of food from an early age. The bakers of boyar estates kept their recipes secret, passing them down from generation to generation like valuable relics. Sometimes even ground nuts or flower petals were added to the dough, especially for weddings, where the loaf was an integral part of the ritual. At princely feasts, bread could be served with meat gravy or cut into thin slices covered with nut paste, and all this within the same wheat splendor, which in the countryside was beyond the reach of even a dream. Bread played a role not only as food, but also as a marker of time. On certain days, only certain shapes were baked, and by them you could tell which feast was coming. During important negotiations, boyars organized a symbolic breaking of the loaf, a gesture signifying openness and peaceful intentions. Bread was stored in chests, wrapped in birch bark or cloth, rubbed with salt and dried on nails to be used later in chowder or grated in sauces. Even in periods of siege or winter famine, the boyars could afford a supply of white bread, and this became the envy of all those lower down the ladder of estates. Bread was both food and a symbol, and even a kind of household altar. It was put on the table first and put away last. In this piece of dough and heat was the history of the family, wealth, skills, and faith. And as long as there was white bread in the boyar's house, it meant that there was still power in it. Condiments and sauces, salt as gold, vinegar as a weapon. In the life of a boyar, salt was not just a seasoning, it was a strategic resource, the value of which was sometimes equal to silver. Salt works in the Russian north brought huge profits. White salt from Ustюг or Perm land was traded for furs, honey, fabrics, and went into the princes' and boyars' pantries. It was used not only for flavor, but also as the main way of preserving products, especially meat, fish, and vegetables in long winters. Salt stockpiles in the house could tell more about a family's wealth than a chest of jewelry. Spices, a luxury and a symbol of the outside world, were imported by merchants from Byzantium, the Mediterranean, and even from the shores of India. Black pepper, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, saffron. Chronicles mention embassies that returned with cargoes of oriental aromatics, and the first to taste these flavors were not princes, but boyars close to the trade routes. Spices cost fabulous money, so they were kept under lock and key and often strictly dosed. A few peppercorns in a meat chowder could change the flavor of the dish beyond recognition. Often such spices were used as tokens of special respect at the reception of guests. Their presence on the table spoke of the wealth and connections of the host. The sauces of boyar cuisine were rich and complex, cooked for hours and often based on berries, cranberries, blackthorn, cherry. They were grated, boiled with honey or vinegar, garlic, crushed herb seeds, and onions were added. Such sauces were especially appreciated in the cold season. They not only enhanced the flavor of meat, but also helped to keep it fresh due to the acidic environment. Mustard, especially homemade mustard with honey, was applied to fish and game, and horseradish with vinegar became a tradition for all heavy roasted meat. Vinegar was made from fermented honey, apples, or wine residue, and it was valued as a means of enhancing flavor, curing, and in rare cases, even as a weapon. Thrown into wine, it could cause severe stomach irritation. There are records mentioning that at feasts for the boyars cooked a special hot sauce with zell and tarum, which had more than 10 herbs, including wormwood, St. John's wort, and thyme. Even bitterness had a place in the boyar's household. The flavor was considered medicinal, especially during periods of winter exhaustion, when the body required stimulation and warming. Cold sauces were stored in clay pots placed in glaciers or earthen cellars, and on special occasions in silver vessels with lids to preserve the flavor. Some recipes were inherited and kept secret. The composition of the sauce could be a cause for envy and even disputes between the mistresses of two boyar houses. When important guests came to the house, the boyar's cooks would display a whole board of spices and sauces, and among the dishes, it was considered the most important to choose the seasoning that emphasized the strength and freshness of the main product. Boyar hunting dishes such as wild boar or bear meat required especially rich seasonings, with lingonberry sauce, crushed garlic, sour wine, and dried nettle powder. The cooking process itself was complex. First, the meat was soaked in vinegar and herbs, then marinated in garlic mush, then fried and poured with a hot sauce of honey, salt, and berries. Such dishes could cost a fortune, and their taste was remembered for years. And for boyar children, it was the first spicy memories of childhood. Interestingly, spices were sometimes used not only in the kitchen, but also in rituals. Cinnamon and cloves were put in the ashes in the bath to scent the air, and pepper was mixed into ointments for cold and rheumatism. In boyars' refectories where feasts were held, there was often a separate aromatic shelf where rare spices were kept in small glass or wooden jars decorated with carvings. Some boyars even hired special spice servants whose task was only to grind, store, and distribute the spices. So high was their value. Among the boyars' winter memories, there was often a mention of mint vinegar, which was used to sprinkle on baked pears or slices of game to refresh the flavor. Sometimes berries and spices were used to make a thick paste similar to modern chutneys, especially in the southern lands closer to the steppe, where oriental flavors were more inclined. In those days, seasoning was not a secondary element, but a full-fledged part of the table ritual, capable of making a dish festive or everyday, depending on the nuance. Salt could even be the subject of diplomatic negotiations. There are known cases when boyars bought the right to mine in salt places from princes or foreign merchants. Spices were worth their weight in gold, and sometimes dozens of sables or gilded belts were given for a handful of pepper. All this made a boyar's food not only tasty, but also politically significant. Food told where he came from, with whom he traded, what his house could afford. Sauces and condiments in boyar life were like ornaments. One could survive without them, but with them life became full of flavor, fire, and a sense of power. And in each piece, poured with hot berry broth and horseradish, was not only food, but also memory, tradition, and the taste of power. Drinking, from mead to kvass. Drinking in a boyar's house was not just a supplement to food, but an important part of the daily routine and feast culture, where each feast was accompanied by a special ritual of serving drinks. Mead was considered the drink of the elite. It was infused for years using flower honey, spring water, berries and spices, and only rich houses allowed themselves to keep in the cellars dozens of barrels with different aging. Often mead was poured into patterned goblets of silver or pewter, sometimes even with lids to preserve the flavor. And it was offered to the senior boyars first as a symbol of respect and position. In the winter months, spicy hot mead with hops and juniper was especially appreciated. It warmed and gave strength, especially after long journeys through snowy forests. Kvass, although it was considered a simpler drink, occupied an important place in the boyar household and existed in dozens of varieties, from weak table kvass to thick, rich kvass, which was infused with mint, raisins, honey, and dried apples. It was made in their own fermenters, watching the temperature and time. The process was delicate, and good kvass was valued no less than wine. Every morning in big houses they served light kvass or sour oat decoction. It helped to wake up, improve digestion, and prepared the stomach for a big meal. Both children and old people could drink kvass. It had almost no alcohol, but a lot of benefits and flavor, especially if the drink was aged in oak barrels. At great feasts, especially in honor of the arrival of princes or foreign ambassadors, wine brought from the south, Byzantine, Greek, Crimean, could be put on the boyar's table. It came in sealed clay amphorae or glass bottles, often accompanied by a sealing wax seal testifying to its authenticity. Such a drink was a rarity, Not every merchant reached Moscow or Novgorod without losing part of his goods on the way or falling into the hands of robbers. Therefore, even a drop of southern wine was perceived as an honor and was served only in a narrow circle, where each guest knew how much this generosity cost. On weekdays, they drank sour herbal drinks, spiton made of herbs, honey and spices, morses made of forest berries, hoppy decoctions made of raspberries and kalina. They were boiled in copper cauldrons, infused in earthenware, and then cooled in wells or glaciers. Sometimes roots such as calgane, ginger, or elecampane were added for flavor and strength, especially in Lent or when sick. Such drinks were considered both useful and protective against bad diseases, and were poured when traveling, hunting, or before a long fast. Drinking accompanied the meal all the time, even in the morning. One could not start a meal without a small sip to awaken the blood, so they said. Kvass with horseradish was served for lunch, mead with raisins in the evening, and hot spiton heated on the stove on holidays. Each drink had the character of the house. Some had more spices, some had tart hops, others had the flavor of dried berries and pears. The first thing a host who welcomed a guest would do was to offer a drink. And by what was in the cup, one could judge whether the house was rich, whether the host was generous, whether they knew how to keep honor. Mead was brewed in large volumes, in oak tubs according to ancient recipes handed down from generation to generation. Drinks aged in barrels under a layer of wax in a cold cellar were especially strong. They could be left untouched for years, waiting for a special occasion. Chronicles mention how boyars organized honey competitions, whose mead was stronger, whose was cleaner, whose flavor was softer. These competitions were not only a holiday, but also a way to make a name for oneself in society. A good drink opened doors as well as friendship with the prince. Water as a drink was almost never used. It was considered dead and was drunk only during fasts or in special heat, and even then, after boiling or infusion on herbs. Even simple spring water could be improved, with lemongrass, honey, or a pinch of salt to add flavor and preserve health. The ability to brew kvass or spiton was valued among women no less than the ability to embroider. It was a skill of running a house, taking care of health, and the ability to keep guests. In the boyar circle, they even said, "Where the kvass is light, the spirit is good," implying that a lot depends on the drink in the house. In winter, after a hunt or a long journey, hot honey with pepper was served, a hot, warming drink that dispersed the blood and saved from colds. They drank it a little at a time, in small sips, standing by the stove, often wrapped in fur. It was a ritual of return, rest, and treat. Even monasteries, where there was a strict statute, brewed their drinks on honey, adding medicinal herbs, and sometimes supplied them to boyar families. Alcohol in such drinks was not the purpose, but a byproduct. The main thing was taste, strength, and warmth, which remained in the body and in the memory. First dishes: soup, chowder. First courses in the diet of a medieval boyar were more than just food. They warmed the body, satiated the body after long hours of riding or hunting, and served as a kind of culinary ritual of every day. Shchi on strong beef broth, boiled with sauerkraut, was on the table almost all year round, but their thickness and strength were especially appreciated during the long winter months when each spoonful seemed to bring back strength. Cabbage was specially sauerkraut in wooden barrels in the fall. It was stored in cellars from where it was taken out little by little, supplementing it with corned beef, smoked ribs, and spices like laurel and oregano. In winter, the soup could freeze right in pots on the windowsill, and then it was heated on the stove, adding a spoonful of sour cream or a piece of black bread. A simple but surprisingly warm dish. Soup was not inferior to soup in importance, especially during fasts when meat was forbidden, and rich fish broth became a substitute for nutritious chowder. In boyar houses, soup was made of sterlet, starred sturgeon, pike perch, and other royal fish, which were brought from rivers and ponds belonging to the boyar himself. Sometimes fish soup was brought to perfection by adding saffron, oregano pepper, a little vinegar or lemongrass, creating a bright, memorable flavor. Uku was served in large clay bowls with a shot of mead and a loaf of fresh bread. It warmed, satiated, and was considered a real decoration of the table. Thick chowder was cooked with whatever was at hand. Meat, lard, cereals, dried vegetables, herbs, all slowly simmered in the stove, filling the house with the aromas of earth and smoky fat. Buckwheat, millet, or buckwheat groats were used as a base. They were poured in generously so that the chowder became almost porridge, which could be eaten with a spoon standing up. Dried mushrooms, especially white mushrooms, brought a bright taste and smell of the forest to the chowder, and dried turnips and parsnips added sweetness and nutrition. These were not just vegetables, but home stocks, carefully preserved from the fall. The chowder took half a day to cook. It was put in a Russian oven on a slow heat, and then covered with a wooden lid and a linen cloth to let the flavor infuse. Sometimes they put baked meat with bones in the chowder, which gave the broth a special depth and oiliness. Such dishes were especially appreciated by the elders in the house, who had a hard time eating dry roast. Monastic chronicles describe how such chowder was cooked not only in houses, but also in refectories, and even in campaigns, in cauldrons on the fire, surrounded by soldiers and vigilantes. The chowder was often sprinkled with herbs, dried dill, onions, mint, and in winter, when fresh herbs were not available, they used powders of dried herbs gathered in the summer months. It was not only a taste, but also a protection. Many herbs were considered to be protective, empowering, and warding off illnesses. In many boyar estates, there were special kitchens where soups were cooked exclusively. There were cooks shavars who could tell by eye how much salt to put, when to add cabbage, and how long to cook fish. At feasts, the first dishes were served first, not as an obligatory element, but as a sign of respect for the guest invited to share warmth and food. Often, the host himself started the meal with a spoonful of soup or soup, signaling to the others. It was not just a meal, but part of the ancient Slavic rite of hospitality. And the thicker the broth was, the richer the taste, the higher was considered the honor of the house, able to feed not only itself, but also its neighbors and travelers who came by in bad weather. She and chowder could be lean or fast, depending on the calendar, and a competent cook knew dozens of recipes for different seasons. Some added soaked apples or rye kvass to the soup for acidity and special flavor, which was considered a real luxury. Sometimes they cooked chowder with mutton, pearl, and dried carrots, seasoned with garlic and onions. Such food was well preserved and tasted better even on the second day. In the richest houses, they used not simple water, but meat or fish broth as a base, layer by layer accumulating flavor and strength, as if transferring the energy of food to the body itself. In this way, first courses became not only the beginning of the meal, but also a living part of the boyar world, where every ingredient was obtained with labor, preserved wisely, and prepared with respect for time, season, and guest. Feasts and ceremonies, food as a demonstration of power. For a boyar, a feast was more than just a meal. It was a tool of political influence, a way to show strength, generosity, and status in front of peers and subordinates. Such feasts were meticulously prepared in advance. Weeks were spent preparing, smoking meat, baking loaves, hiring musicians, cleaning the chamber, and decorating the table with rushniki, gatherings, and fresh birch branches. The feast could last for 3 days, and sometimes more if important guests were gathered or church holidays were celebrated. Each day the meal was started with a new scale, as if it had just begun. The food was served in waves. First they served cold appetizers, salted mushrooms, pickled apples, jellies, meat-poured dishes with horseradish. Then they moved on to soup and soup. Then came the main course, roast, game, fish, and egg pies. The alternation of dishes was strictly regulated. No hostess would allow herself to mix meat with lean meat, serve soup after soup, or forget about the ritual loaf. Each feast began with a blessing and bread and salt, which was served on a rushnik decorated with embroidery. It was this moment that showed respect for the guest and the sacral meaning of food. The dishes themselves often symbolize power. For example, a whole-baked swan or a goose with apples in its beak. It was not just a taste, but a statement about the power of the host, his capabilities, and the skill of the cooks. The pies could hide whole surprises: boiled eggs, pieces of fish, vegetables, spices. When they were cut, the table exploded with flavors and delight. The servants wore clean clothes, often embroidered canvas shirts with belts, and served the dishes in a well-defined order, first to the elders, then to the noble guests, then to the others. Dishes also spoke of status: silver goblets, painted wooden bowls, pewter spoons, and even personal knives, which guests brought with them in special sheaths. In rich houses, there was a special hierarchy of service. The senior servant followed the order of serving, the younger ones brought the dishes, and the kitchen manager stood guard over the hot and fresh. Often music was played at feasts: psaltery, horns, whistles, and in between meals tales were sung, spiritual poems were sung, and competitions in strength or marksmanship were organized. Many dishes were prepared only for feasts, for example, cold pig's heads, bay sturgeon, piglets stuffed with buckwheat and raisins, or chicken stewed in milk with garlic and bay leaf. Such recipes were passed down through the family, kept secret, and cooks who could cook correctly were valuable and could move from house to house with a high salary. Boyars competed among themselves in the scale of treats. The feast was a field of honor, no less than a battlefield. Sometimes even foreign guests, ambassadors, merchants were invited, and they brought back tales of incredible feasts where mead poured down like a river and dozens of dishes were served. It is interesting that the meal ceremony began long before the meal was served. Guests gathered, exchanged gifts, discussed business, and then they were escorted to the dining room where they smelled sauerkraut, smoked meat, baked pies, and spices. To refuse a treat was considered an insult, and even if the guest did not eat meat, he had to at least try it and thank for the bread and salt. Sometimes the feast was preceded by a hunt, and the game killed in the morning was served in the evening, still soaked in smoke and blood, as a sign of courage and strength of the house. And for the boyars' children, the feast became a real lesson in adult life. Here they learned to speak, listen, choose a dish, hold a goblet, and observe the hierarchy. At large feasts, there was a custom of distributing leftovers. Part of the food was given to the poor, travelers, servants, and monasteries, and this demonstrated not only the generosity, but also the righteousness of the house. Wine was rarely served, mostly strong kvass and mead, but on special occasions, amphorae with Crimean wine or barrels with Hungarian Tokajski could appear. In the evening, candles lit up the chamber, reflecting in copper and silver dishes, and servants were already gathering in the streets, carrying the remains of the meal to the monasteries and neighboring villages. Such was the feast, not just an event, but a vivid statement of power, order, piety, and prosperity, where every bite of food spoke of power. Fruits, nuts, and sweets. Fruit in a boyar's diet was not just a dessert. It was a symbol of abundance and prosperity, especially during the long winter months when fresh berries and fruits were unavailable, and dried apples, pears, and plums were stored in cellars and cellars, preserving the taste of summer. Preparing dried fruits was a real art. They were not just dried, but sometimes dried with honey and spices to retain their flavor and nutritional value, allowing the sweetness to be brought to the table even on the coldest days. Walnuts, pine nuts, and hazelnuts became a welcome addition to the feast. They were extracted and grown on boyar estates, but many were imported from southern regions and the Caucasus, emphasizing the international connections and wealth of the host. It was nuts and dried fruits that often decorated festive dishes, sprinkled on top of pies and casseroles, giving the meal a special flavor and status. Sweets were a real rarity, and therefore on special holidays, boyars allowed themselves treats. Honey, selected and thick, became the basis for honey gingerbread and cakes, which were baked by hand, often with the addition of spicy herbs and dried fruits. Honey products decorated the table. They were served together with nuts and fruits as a sign of generosity and prosperity, because honey was an expensive commodity, extracted not only in the native lands, but also brought from distant regions. Jam, another exquisite sweet, which was prepared from apples, pears, berries, and even dogwood, cooked these delicacies in large vats stored in wooden barrels to be able to enjoy natural sweetness for a long time. Sometimes the jam was so thick and concentrated that it was served as an independent dish, with slices of fresh bread or pies. Fruit and nut gathering and processing were an important part of the boyar economy. Estates included orchards and nut groves, where peasants and servants worked, and caring housewives made sure that there was enough to last the whole year. Berries, raspberries, blueberries, cranberries, were often used for medicinal purposes, adding them to drinks and first courses, which helped to maintain health in harsh times. At festive tables, fruits were not just decorated, they were presented in whole baskets, and it became a kind of ceremony when guests were shown how rich and generous the host was. Especially valued were fruits brought from distant lands, figs, pomegranates, and citrus fruits, which were only brought to the table of the most influential boyars and only on big celebrations. Honey gingerbread had a special meaning. They were exchanged as a sign of respect and friendship between boyar families, and sometimes they were hidden inside pies, creating a sweet surprise. These delicacies were sometimes adorned on the heads and clothes of children at festivals, and on cold winter evenings they were eaten with hot honey and herbal infusions. Berry and fruit jam was also used to flavor sours and compotes, drinks that were an obligatory part of feasts, helping to quench thirst and giving strength. It is interesting that honey and sweets were considered not only as food, but also as a medicine that could support the body in times of illness and weakness. All this sweet luxury, dried pears and apples, nuts, gingerbread and jam, was not just food, but a sign that the boyar's house was full of abundance and health, and each piece carried a piece of the owner's warmth and care for his relatives and guests. Fruit and sweets became part of the culture that helped to preserve traditions and pass on history through the generations, showing how even in harsh times it was possible to find a place of joy and celebration. Cold and hunger are a constant threat even in the terem. Despite the wealth and luxury of the terem, the boyar always lived with the realization that winter could bring cold and hunger, which spared no one. Neither the simple peasant nor the great prince, and therefore the stocks in the pantries and storerooms were the basis of survival. Corned beef, dried meat, and fish, as well as grain and cereals, were stored in large wooden barrels and sacks, often in special cold cellars, which helped to preserve the products as long as possible without spoilage. In houses, even with fireplaces and stoves, it was extremely difficult to maintain a stable heat. Thick walls and narrow windows barely kept the cold penetrating through the cracks, and therefore fatty and caloric food rich in meat and oil became a necessary source of energy to fight the cold. Historical chronicles testify that in severe winters, the boyars organized real food military operations, preparing supplies as carefully as if they expected a siege. After all, in castles and terems, they could be cut off from the outside world. Poor harvests, which periodically occurred, aggravated the problem. Even boyar households suffered from the lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, and this sharply affected the health and mood of the inhabitants. It was in such periods that careful attention to supplies became the key not only to a comfortable life, but also to survival. After all, hunger could touch everyone. Many boyars stored not only food, but also seeds for planting in future seasons, turning their farms into real outposts of stability and self-sufficiency. Stoves and fireplaces were heated not only for comfort, but also for drying and smoking food, which helped to preserve meat and fish for the whole winter. However, even wealth did not save from harsh realities. Chronicles describe cases when severe frost led to the loss of livestock and spoilage of stocks. And in the harshest winters, boyars had to reduce their rations and switch to simpler food, which was perceived as a great misfortune. Difficulties were also imposed on the delivery of provisions. The roads became impassable in winter, and trade caravans became vulnerable to bandits and brigands, which made stocks the only stronghold. It was because of this that seasonal preparations, pickles, sours, and dried foods, which were able to prolong life and strength for several months, became especially important. Many boyars set up additional storerooms in different parts of the estate to keep at least part of the stock in case of possible dangers. Frosty evenings and long nights became a time when the family gathered around a common table, where food acquired a special symbolism. It was not just to satisfy hunger, but an act of protection and unity. Tales of winter gatherings in tarems in front of the fireplace, where conversations were held and business was planned, are preserved in folk legends and chronicles, showing how even wealthy boyars lived with anxiety in the face of cold and hardship. Despite this, boyar cooks and hostesses tried to keep the feast on the table, creating dishes that lifted spirits and gave hope for the best. This contrast between affluence and the constant threat of hunger and cold makes an understanding of medieval life particularly vivid and dramatic. Thus, food and supplies in the boyar terem are not only a symbol of wealth, but also a reflection of the harsh reality of the time, where each winter was a victory over the elements and severe trials. The knowledge of how to prepare for winter, how to preserve food and save stocks was passed from generation to generation, and not only the life of a particular house, but also the fate of entire clans and states depended on it. Each dish, each handful of grain in the cold time, was the result of labor and care, sometimes much more significant than just a tasty meal. This struggle against cold and hunger is an important part of a boyar's life, a reminder that even in the luxury of the Middle Ages, there was still an unrelenting struggle for survival. Strict fasting rules. The church in medieval Russia played a key role not only in spiritual life, but also in the formation of food habits of the boyars, and it was she who established the strict rules of fasting, according to which almost 200 days a year, the food had to be fasting. That is, without meat, milk, and eggs. During these fasting periods, the boyar's diet changed dramatically. Fish, vegetables, cereals, and bread appeared on the table, and the dishes were prepared in such a way that the taste was exquisite, and strict observance of traditions was obligatory. Breaking the fast was considered not just a sin, but a serious misdemeanor, which could lead to loss of social status and even exclusion from the boyar circle, because the church was closely intertwined with power and control over society. Despite the restrictions, the boyars knew how to turn a Lenten meal into a real feast, using a variety of seasonings, fresh and dried vegetables, mushrooms, fish of various kinds, and complex recipes that were passed down from generation to generation. Historical documents testify that at large princely and boyar feasts during Lent, dishes of sturgeon, sterlet, and starred sturgeon were served. Fish that was considered a real luxury, worthy only of the upper class. Since the fast was long and included periods of Great Lent, Christmas Lent, and others, many boyars had special cookbooks and cooks who were trained in the art of preparing exquisite Lenten dishes in order to maintain honor and respect at court feasts. Observance of external rituals was also an important element. Dishes were decorated and served with special solemnity to emphasize the sanctity of the moment and respect for church regulations. In those times, even Lenten food was not simple and meager. It was filled with meaning, tradition, and aesthetics, which allowed the boyars to retain their dignity and status, despite the refusal to eat the usual meat and dairy products. Fasting served not only as a spiritual purification, but also as a kind of test of willpower and discipline, as well as a way of demonstrating piety and respect for church canons. It is known that monasteries and boyar houses often organize competitions and demonstrations of culinary skills during the Lenten days, where cooks competed in the ability to prepare tasty and nourishing dishes without forbidden ingredients. Among the most popular Lenten dishes were soups with mushroom or vegetable broth, porridge with berries and honey, dumplings with vegetable stuffing, various pickles and sours, which made food not only tasty but also nutritious. Fish in such conditions played the role of the main source of protein, and it was prepared in a variety of ways: boiled, baked in dough, smoked and dried. Herbal and berry decoctions, which were served to the table instead of milk drinks, also had a separate meaning. This complex and carefully calibrated diet of fasting served as a kind of balance between strict church regulations and the desire of boyar society to preserve the usual luxury and comfort. Even during periods of fasting, when food seemed scarce and limited, an atmosphere of opulence and prosperity reigned in boyar terems, because fasting was perceived not as a deprivation, but as an opportunity to demonstrate the ability to combine the spiritual and material. Food restrictions contributed to the development of new culinary traditions and cooking techniques, which centuries later remained popular and reflected the people's deep connection to religious rituals. Ultimately, fasting was an integral part of a boyar's life, a manifestation of discipline and respect for higher powers, which affected not only health and diet, but also social status and reputation. Medieval boyar cuisine is not just a set of dishes, but a whole world filled with traditions, symbols, and history, where every meal was a reflection of power, status, and deep cultural values. As you immerse yourself in this world, it becomes clear that the food of a boyar is both an art of survival and a luxury available to only a few, and a way of keeping in touch with the past, with the roots, and with the very essence of the era. Today, looking at these ancient recipes and traditions, one can feel all the strength, courage, and wisdom with which our ancestors met cold, hunger, and adversity, without forgetting the enjoyment of life and respect for customs. If you are interested in learning more about the mysteries of the Middle Ages, the life and secrets of the past centuries, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to discover more fascinating pages of history together.